Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is the task force orientation, which we've entitled ILCOR Beyond 2015 Point and Click, and I'm representing the Continuous Evidence Evaluation team for ILCOR. My name is Laurie Morrison, and I'm from St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, Canada. These are my COI declarations, both past and present, and my roles in ILCOR prior to this. Today I'm going to cover a brief history of ILCOR, how we derived the Epstein-style templates, our prior internal science review, how that contributed to resuscitation guidelines, and a brief overview of the CEE process as proposed in the strategic plan of 2016 and implemented shortly after. So ILCOR was an early international collaboration that actually began in June 1990 in a meeting in Mostrøy, Norway, of 4 councils: the American Heart, European Resusc, Heart and Stroke Canada, and Australian Resuscitation Council. It was held in the beautiful Epstein Abbey. For those of you who have used the Epstein templates but never known what the Abbey looked like, it's a very deserted, beautiful spot. It doesn't have a lot of internet, as you can imagine, so there's a lot of thought-provoking conversations, and those are particularly helpful for the Epstein template derivations. Just a brief thank you to Douglas Chamberlain, Richard Cummins, and Max Harry-Weil, who were instrumental in the startup of ILCOR and the first Epstein template. This was the very first one, Douglas Chamberlain and Richard Cummins, the recommended guidelines for uniform reporting of data. This is the classic Epstein style. Now, what was recommended in 1991 was the certain data points that should be collected on all cardiac arrests. And this was the classic Epstein style template for reporting data, and it is used by EMS services all over the world to performance benchmark. You can see that the ILCOR group collaborated, or a group of resuscitation scientists, after the formation of ILCOR, collaborated together to produce 7 different Epstein-style international consensus statements in which the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest reporting template was updated in 2004 and again in 2014. The first meeting of the ILCOR International Liaison Committee was held at the end of an ERC Congress in 1992. And again, there were the 4 original groups and the addition of the Resuscitation Council of Southern Africa. In 1993, they developed a liaison committee on CPR to provide a consensus mechanism by which the international science and knowledge relevant to emergency cardiac care could be identified and reviewed. And the purpose was to provide international guidelines, BLS, TLS, and ALS. So that was their beginning in 1993 of evidence review, and the output was guidelines. In 1996, they formed the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation, so it got its branded name of ILCOR, and in 1997, they produced their first ILCOR advisory statements. And this is an example of that. First author was Dr. Clark from South Africa, and this was the Universal ALS algorithm. So ILCOR, in its beginnings, was publishing guidelines and algorithms. This was the Universal ALS algorithm published in ILCOR in 1997. You can see there is certainly the stack defibrillation ×3, which should bring back memories for some. The first guidelines were published by ILCOR in 2000. This was their first attempt to achieve global, standardized CPR guidelines based on science. They were published after a meeting in Dallas in February 2000. And each council then took the international guidelines and published their own set of guidelines. So here we are, the American Heart Guidelines in 2000. and there's where the European resuscitation guidelines were published in Resuscitation. Then, shortly thereafter, two sentinel RCTs were published on targeted temperature management, one by the Viennese group and one by the Australian group, which was published after the guidelines were released, and therefore ILCOR published its first advisory statement on therapeutic hypothermia after cardiac arrest. And they did so using a small writing group and members of the ALS as well as the Pediatric Life Support Task Force. ILCOR has grown now to include resuscitation councils all over the world, and it has separated its mission away from guidelines. So ILCOR in 2005 took on the science, which is to review the science and to develop a consensus on science and treatment recommendations, and then deferring to the resuscitation councils all over the world to develop their own local guidelines. So 2005 is sort of a separation of mission versus mission of ILCOR versus the mission of the council. So in 2010, we took a more rigorous process, and now our focus was entirely on doing a really good job on the consensus on science. So in 2010, we took on an evidentiary approach to developing the PICOs, which are the population intervention control and outcome format for our research questions. And in order to derive those, we looked at the algorithms. We looked at the treatment algorithm in one council guideline or multiple council guidelines, and we derived questions. So this is an example of the ALS task force. They looked at the ALS algorithm, and they derived 150 PICOs. In 2010, we recruited 300 international authors, so 2 authors per PICO, to review the evidence. They were called evidence reviewers. This is what your PICO question looks like. It still looks like it's almost exactly the same today. We just add D at the end for design. So it's population intervention control outcome and D for design. If you want to restrict it to randomized controlled trials versus observation, or you want them all. So this is a PICO question in adult cardiac arrest, both pre-hospital and in-hospital, address our population. Does the use of pacing, example, transvenous, transcardiac, or needle, is our intervention, compared with standard resuscitation or no pacing, which is the control. Does it improve outcomes? And the ones we're looking at, we'll look at any of them, but the ones particularly we're interested in is ROSC, and survival is the O. So the next point, once we had derived our PICO, now we needed to review the science. And the way we did it in 2010 was we lumped the papers that were in support of the PICO, of the intervention, and we rank ordered them based on their quality along the left-hand axis, which good, fair, or poor, and the level of evidence was based on the quality of the design and the quality of the study, and they were lumped accordingly. So this is the quality of the methodology. This is the type of methodology. So 4 obviously isn't very good methodology. 1 would be randomized controlled trials, and then randomized controlled trials that are methodologically done very well would score right here in this box, in a good box. And these were all the outcomes listed across the bottom, and you can see that each paper is clarified as to which outcome. So this is a table of support for the intervention. This would be a table of papers that are neutral to the intervention, so it doesn't show one, the intervention is better than control. And this is the table of evidence opposing the intervention. In other words, control was better than the intervention. Then the task force took it upon themselves, after the evidence reviewers had reviewed all the science and presented the evidentiary tables, then the task force worked together to develop a consensus on science and treatment recommendation. This was presented in Dallas in January 2010, and submitted for publication in Circulation and Resuscitation in June 2010. So this is an example of the consensus on science, where it's clearly stated there are 3 levels of evidence to studies, and which the quality of the study is included immediately after the paper. So this is Barthel's paper, published in 1988, and the first page of that paper is page number 1221, and FAIR is the quality of the methodology. And one LOE3 study addressed the efficacy of pacing in cardiac arrest. All of these studies observed no benefit from pacing in cardiac arrest patients. Use of pacing in cardiac arrest does not improve outcome. There is no apparent benefit associated with the timing of pacing administration, the location of the arrest, or the primary cardiac rhythm. So in summary of the process, in 2010, there were 150 questions, 300 authors. We, at the ALS Task Force, we employed a coaching where the task force members provided coaching. We split up the 300 authors, and we coached the evidence reviewers through the process. And then there were 50 U.S. and Canadian. I just chose the U.S. Canadian to collect them, but there were 50 guidelines were published in October 18, 2010. So you can see that both the consensus on science, which is the top part here, top part is published in Circulation, and the American guidelines are published also in Circulation. This is just an example of one council taking the evidence review from ILCOR and making it their own, and producing their own guidelines. So ILCOR does the systematic reviews and tells the world what is the evidence, and then each council uses that evidence to decide what they're going to do in their region. So the 2015 output was essentially an update, but we employed a new evidence approach, which was the GRADE approach. GRADE working group. And the GRADE working group is making recommendations all across many disciplines in medicine. And the factors to consider when using the GRADE approach was the quality of evidence, which is not dissimilar to what we used in 2010. It also looked at the balance between benefits and harm. It also considered patient values and preferences and could allow the task force to bring in values and preferences based on science as well, and also could employ, if there were any published articles on cost effectiveness, it could bring in cost or human resources to weigh and affect the strength of the recommendation. And what is also important with GRADE is GRADE forces a recommendation, whereas without GRADE, many of the recommendations in 2010 was that there was insufficient evidence to make a recommendation. GRADE, on the other hand, because if the quality of evidence was poor, you could look at the benefits and harms, the values and preferences, and the resource costs or the implications locally to try to look at what if you could make a recommendation based on science. So GRADE forced us in 2015 to make more definitive recommendations, like a strong recommendation for would be we recommend, or a weak conditional recommendation against, we would say we suggest not doing A versus B. So in 2015, the PICO really didn't change. You can see the population intervention, controller comparison, and outcomes. Really didn't change much. The only difference was with GRADE in the outcomes, you had to rank order based on importance, the outcomes. So for example, in this particular question, I'll just go back, under adults or children who are in cardiac arrest outside a hospital, does the ability of a dispatch system to provide CPR instructions compared with a dispatch system where no CPR instructions are ever provided change the outcome? And the outcomes that were listed were survival with favorable neurological, survival at discharge, 30 days, 60 days, 180 days, or at 1 year, and that was deemed by the task force to be critical and the highest ranking outcome. The second highest ranking critical outcome was survival only at discharge 30 days, 60 days, 180, or a year. And the third critical outcome was ROSC. And then delivery of bystander CPR, the time to commence CPR, and CPR parameters such as what is the initial rhythm were deemed important. So we rank ordered in an effort to try to rank order what the importance of how we were going to summarize the literature. If there was lots of literature about our number one critical outcome, then we could be very definitive in our statements and our recommendations. So the other change in 2015 was that we engaged information specialists to run the searches. So they became very uniform. They were across 3 data sets, PubMed, Embase, Cochrane, and sometimes we searched otherwise. So that every search was done by highly qualified information specialists, and every search covered at least 3 data sets. We also used the grade evidence tables for each PICO, which forced us to be more, instead of just 3 ways to classify quality, there were a number of ways across risk of bias, inconsistency, indirectness, imprecision, and any other consideration to look at the quality of the study. We also put together a relative and absolute risk reduction with 95% confidence intervals. We gave an overall ranking of quality. And of course, this was already preset by the task force to say this outcome, which is survival with favorable neurological outcome at discharge, was critical and our number 9 in terms of importance. Just to drill down a little bit more into the quality, we looked at the risk of bias in the study. So I'll just show you where we are. In the grade evidentiary table, there's a risk of bias right here. And you can see it's for this particular paper by Tom Ray, published in 2010, the risk of bias is considered not serious. And we got to that by looking at this criteria. So, we looked at eligibility criteria, exposure and outcome, confounding, and follow-up. So here's Tom Ray's, no, it's not the right one. Oh, I've taken it from a different one, sorry. But you can see that if there is a low risk of bias across this paper by Bray in 2011, then this would be considered a low risk of bias in this particular paper. Whereas this one right here by Tanaka, which is unclear across many and has a high risk of bias here, this would be ranked very poorly in terms of risk of bias in studies. The basic, just an example of the basic life support task force, but each one of these grade evidentiary tables for each PICO was presented to the task force and debated. And through that debate and that discussion, they derived their consensus on science. So you can see here for the critical outcome of survival with favorable neurological outcome, we have identified very low quality evidence from 2 randomized controlled trials, 2 cohort studies, and 1 before and after study. The level of evidence was downgraded for risk of bias, which is here, indirectness, and imprecision. 4 studies reported no benefit. The before and after study, which included dispatcher instructions to start compression only as a bundle of interventions used as part of a quality improvement initiative, noted improved neurological outcomes at 12 months, and the odds ratio and the confidence intervals are given here. We then employed in 2015 a public disclosure, and public comments were encouraged. And so this is an example of Mickey Eisenberg, who is a notable scientist in resuscitation from Seattle. He was not on the task force and not part of the evidence review, but when that particular co-star was published, he had an opportunity through this public comment interface to review all the data and to encourage or urge your group to consider adding something along the following lines. So this is extremely helpful because the task force is only composed of a small number of scientists across the world, and there are other scientists out there, and perhaps lay people and perhaps industry people who may have a perspective, a point of view that the task force may want to consider. And that public comment will be is endorsed as well in our continuous evidence evaluation view going forward. So the treatment recommendation, which we did, just to remind you, this was the consensus on science. After public commentary, and we got the science right, then the task force worked on a treatment recommendation. We recommend that dispatchers provide chest compression only CPR instructions to callers for adults with suspected out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. It's a strong recommendation, even though it has low-quality evidence. And this was probably the most challenging for the task forces in 2015 because they had to do values and preferences, and they had to give their insights in a way that the rest of the world would understand and also endorse. So this was an example of values, preferences, and task force insights. In making these recommendations, we placed a higher value on the initiation of bystander CPR and a lower value on the harms of performing CPR on patients who are not in cardiac arrest. We recognize that the evidence in support of these recommendations comes from randomized trials and observational data of variable quality. However, the available evidence consistently favors telephone CPR protocols that use a compression-only CPR instruction set, suggesting a dose effect, that is, quick telephone instructions in chest compressions result in more compressions and faster administration of CPR to the patient. In 2010, we completed 274 PICOs. In 2015, many of these questions were looked at. Some are retired as they weren't relevant to current practice. Some are considered low priority because there'd be very few, it was perceived that there were very few developments in the field since 2010. And in 2015, the residual number of questions left over from 2010 were combined or merged with other questions. We added a first aid task force, which developed 55 questions. And we also added new topics based on task force or public comment on the SEERS website. In total, in 2015, there were 391 PICO questions prioritized for review. Grade was complicated, grade was difficult, and we only completed 165 systematic reviews. We used 232 reviewers to do it, representing 39 countries of origin. So the 2010 guidelines were much more comprehensive than the 2015. So the 2010 guidelines stayed as part of our legacy, but also many of the PICO questions were still relevant and were not addressed in 2015. The 2015 was a guideline update since only a portion of the PICO questions were answered. Now we've learned there were some wonderful infographics made at the time of the release of the AHA guidelines by a group, a Canadian EM emergency medicine group. And these infographics have served to message out and to try to change our science and our guidelines into practice. And this sort of tendency for social media to take over where science leaves off, to try to get the message out, we appreciated in 2016 that we're going to have to embrace this in order to truly get the message out, whether that be the consensus on science, the treatment recommendation, or new guidelines. An example of that would be some of the councils develop their own interactive website, where you can see here's an example. This is the Canadian website, Heart and Stroke Foundation, where they posted their guidelines. So in addition to infographics, which were circulating widely through social media, also there were council guidelines on websites. Now, what's driving a new approach to continuous evidence is the fact that resuscitation science publications, a number of them, is climbing. And you can see here we're pretty flat from 1975 to 1980, from 1954 till 1982, started to gradually climb to 2003, and then there's been a huge upsurge in terms of the number of publications. So this figure alone shows that it's going to be really hard to keep doing this every 5 years when the volume of papers being published is increasing dramatically. We will always be out of date if we aren't doing continuous evidence review. Some examples, too, are large randomized controlled trialists operating across national and international borders to build our sample size. We are becoming more connected and more like traditional disciplines. So we need to have a point-and-click way of accessing our evidence, and to make sure that our treatment and our practice is based on current evidence, not waiting 5 years for an update. We also know from various national bodies, the IOM, for example, in the United States, and the CIHR in Canada, for example, are pushing that there always needs to be a patient and public partnership with science. And this public comment interface that we started in 2015 is really essentially embraced by many national bodies as the way of the future. So it's just not enough to publish the science and not engage those who are potential victims and potential survivors and family members. A good example of that is the COSTA initiative, which is right now an ILCOR-driven process looking at patients. These are 5 patients in the middle there who are contributing to defining what are the most important outcomes in clinical trials and resuscitation. So we're proposing that to take grade one step further, in the sense that we will uniformly apply grade to every PICO question in a continuous review, in a continuous fashion, driven by what is published every day. We will use information specialists to give us our best quality searches, and based on the complexity of the question, we will either choose a systematic review team for a simple question, or we will engage a knowledge synthesis unit for a very complex question. So our proposal, which was endorsed by ILCOR in 2016, was the continuous evidence evaluation will be driven by what is being published on a daily basis, and that we would, instead of using evidence reviewers, we would use systematic reviewers and KSU expert teams combined with content experts from the task forces. We would reconfigure the task forces with individuals who were deemed experts in systematic review as well as resuscitation, and that we would provide a continuous evidence evaluation infrastructure for ILCOR. In order to do this, we needed a way to drive the process based on what's being published. So we engaged the information specialists at St. Michael's Hospital to do an environmental scan of every publication alert system out there in the world. There are many. 2 examples are on the screen here. There's a paper published in BMJ, as well as Research Methods and Reporting in the Open Access. Both PMIDs are here on the screen. These were probably the 2 best papers for looking at how and when to update a systematic review. What would drive through a publication alert would drive ILCOR to do a systematic review. And what we concluded from that was that we could use a very tight publication alert, meaning highest quality, best quality evidence that would have sentinel papers that would say you have to reopen this COSTAR because this RCT is definitive. So that's one form of publication alert. The other form of a publication alert is to build on PubMed, and we're also looking at Cochrane as well as Embase to develop search strategies within each one of those that would look at a broad domain of PICOs, so PICOs that are all grouped about, let's say, defibrillation. We would build a search strategy for that within PubMed, within Embase, and another one within the Cochrane. And it would be much broader. It would take a lot more time to review it, and it probably would have a lot of papers that essentially would never change the COSTAR because the quality of the paper is not strong enough to be definitive. But it would be much more comprehensive than a very targeted publication alert that only looks at the best quality evidence. So to get us started, the first thing we did was we took every PICO question, which was there from 2005, 2010, and 2015, and anything else that the old task forces could want to throw in there. And then we asked them to categorize them into retire, repose, revisit, or they could choose to reassign it. For example, they might say this should be an educational implementation team. It doesn't need to be here in neonatal. So those were the categorizations. The next thing we did was we put out a call for systematic reviewers, and we have now identified our systematic reviewers. We have ILCOR systematic reviewers. I believe there are 14 of them that are identified, and there's at least another 6 or 7 people who've been identified as mentors, meaning they were identified as young people with a genuine interest in systematic reviews and a contribution to ILCOR in the past, and that with good mentorship, they could be systematic reviewers of the future. We are currently engaging knowledge synthesis units, and we hope to rank order all applications and choose the top ones to have as our ILCOR roster of knowledge synthesis units. What's the difference between a knowledge synthesis unit and a systematic reviewer? A systematic reviewer is a single individual who is an accomplished methodologist in systematic reviews, who has a strong track record of many publications in high-quality SRs. A knowledge synthesis unit is usually a collaboration of multiple investigators, multiple biostatisticians, and they provide a synthesis of all the evidence using a complex PICO, meaning we would combine more than one PICO. I will give you an example. So vasopressors in cardiac arrest for peds, adults, and neonates could all be merged into a single PICO given to the synthesis unit, who would then divide out all the different kinds of vasopressors through what's called a network meta-analysis and do a synthesis filter or a sensitivity filter, where they looked at a network meta-analysis of all the vasopressors agents for adults, for kids, and for neonates. So it's a complex PICO, a very comprehensive way of looking at the evidence to a very knowledgeable group. We have actually put this out. You can see it right now. There is a we're taking applications now for the KSU. I believe it closes on March 20th. We have piloted at KSU after the publication of the ROC CCC trial. We did a pilot with a KSU in Canada under Andrea Trico, and the content experts there was one from the pediatric task force, which is Alan DeCon, There was one from the Advanced Life Support, Basic Life Support Group, and that was Gavin Perkins. And those two content experts worked with the KSU, triggered by the publication of this RCT, to develop a very complex PICO, which was in continuous compressions versus CPR. We also looked at compression to ventilation ratio. We looked at multiple settings, dispatcher, bystander, and EMS. We looked at multiple ages, both adult and peds. We did a pre-specified subgroup analysis on EMS response interval and etiology of the cardiac arrest. So in conclusion, it is our hope that in 2017, when we're 25 years old, which is this year, that we will have a point-and-click kind of option where you can see the consensus on science and treatment recommendation published by the task force, and each one of those co-star statements will be driven by a systematic review either done by a KSU or a systematic review done by a systematic reviewer, where the task force has weighed all the evidence and developed a strong consensus on science and treatment recommendation, and that each council will then quickly, as soon as they see the consensus on science posted on the website, they will adjust their guidelines in a point-and-click kind of fashion, adjust their guidelines in accordance, allowing us to truly implement continuous evidence evaluation. Thank you.